다 가서 먼저 어디 디바 샤비 주인 뭐 뜻이거네. 아니 디바 샤바디 디고 마시바레. 어디네 자다 데네기 저기 다 데네기 디바 샤바이나 데네기 디비 샤바텔 데네 어느 저기 디바디 약간 스타그레스네 데네 제와치마 야 동화 첨본 용어야 되게 내 중조 용어야 마 주야다 데네 나돌레 끼나야 나돌이 땡델이야 동화 용어고 받아 안도스네 데네 안에 지금 나돌레 땡조자 땡조리 땡델다가라라 안에 고나와 삼기 안에 디바 다제 제마치와 치말레 동화 용어고 받는데 용구레스 데네 잠 데안에 가르레스네 네 야지 동화 벤균이부 용어에 되기네 야지 동화 야의 뒤투용지래야 지 동화지 좋아지는 용어야 용그래서 네 가르레 야지도 소지금 그 동화 싸우기는 용어에 되는 용그래서 디바 다다들이야 또 수수요래서 내가 상관 된시로.
Good morning. Last night we concluded looking at the presentation on the four opponent powers as skillful means by which one purifies past a non-virtue that one has accumulated. And after concluding looking at the four opponent powers and going through an example meditation, we came to the section, the manner of purification, where we saw the way that, or how purification can be experienced in the sense that if, for example, one has a particular karmic imprint that has the power to propel rebirth into the lower realms. Should one then strive to purify that? The way through purification, the way it can still ripen, is that one will still be born in the lower realms, but the severity of the suffering is greatly reduced. Or alternatively, one is still reborn in the lower realms, but the suffering of that realm is not experienced at all. So either one is born in a lower realm, but the severity of the suffering is much reduced because one is not born in far worse lower realm, or one does not experience the suffering of the lower realms at all. And the third possibility is that one is not born in the lower realms, but the suffering is experienced in a minor way in this very life. So these were some of the possibilities. Further possibilities would be that with this negative karmic imprint being greatly reduced through the power of the four opponent powers, then that when that imprint ripens, the duration is greatly reduced. So instead of suffering for a long period, one does so just for a short period. Or perhaps the suffering experience will never come about, because the strength of the imprint has been reduced to such insignificance that it's unlikely to ever ripen. So therefore, in brief, the suffering result will be through the application of the four opponent powers. The suffering result will be less intense, shorter in duration, or reduced to insignificance.
Nyembo topshi zo ma zo dang, shukcha mitra dang, ne gyuri no so yuko ne yinbe tachi do ngeba medos.
So returning to the text from where we concluded last night, it's in the middle of page 147 in a paragraph under the manner of purification. There is no categorical certainty here, because it also depends on whether the power of the person during the purification is great or small, and on whether the four opponent powers are complete or incomplete, intense or not intense, or of long or short duration, and so on.
Andre 동화 첨본 용어가 되게 충분요야다. 안에 지게 동화 되는 용어야 되는 요래서 돼. 다 두바다서지 나서 손으로 안 돼서 내내 대양 다 되네 용어야디 가르치기 그래서네. 디 정한 또 치중당 년보 돕시 조마조다 슈자 미라다 균링동소 요건이 인베스 지사다디 충주 첨보의 충주 차야다 ane yuning nyongwa din tunu nyongwa ya da ane tene minyo chaya de gimja gare la na di sulu rale osne jongwa zambi dine chagire besen chabe ngeba yo mare la 지사디 정한 top 치숑스보다 되네게 동 정한 top 치숑스도 되네게 디부 님보 도슈고네 디부 샤르도 샤베 갑라 소솔야 top 치숑스네 꿀노 top 치숑스우라 안 꿀노다 꿀노네 타바든에 삼바다 아니 장주심 요코네 라와라 소바다 되네 동바니라 소바다 되네게 삼다 꿀노 top 치숑나 안 되네게 슈 치숑도 네 개발 용거레스 아니 데가세네 디바 달로 슈 치숑디 소시오 꿀노 top 치숑 다 님보 돕치숑 다 되네게다 지금 님보시다 디바샤베 갑라 소수기 냠는 지역이 림바트 쪽으로다 비나카로 콤바이나 빈 동바니 콤이야라 소바다 자주심 콤바이나 님보디게 돕체 작으로와 인디 멤비게다 샹다 네 소수기다 제 차부와라 소바데 되네시나 아직 도신 단 님보 돕초에 거데 개발 용거레스 인디 디시 안디야 마제는 조마소 세데 조마소 세데다 님보 돕시 차상 차나 마상 대 상와이나 아니 슈체용 그래서 제가 디네자 슈트라바다 자다 미저 균이 되네 냠는 지야 되나요? 이 균링통 저수게 균링롱 대 개발용 그래서 가지 디네게다 가질래 군노다 군노 슈체와 디네 님보 겁나 슈체와 디네 아니 가서 우리 냠는 지야 되래 균링보 되는 제바이나 안디게 디바다야데 사 두바다야데 슈체요래 사 망하다도 그래서 그러다 되네기 뉴뉴마도 맞지네 디바다야 되스 중화용 그래서 지사데 되네기 지게 가서 군로야 슈체보 매바 아니님 보톱시야 마상와 아니 지게 되네기 유니고 맞제바지 어디니 디바 샤게세 축식랑한테 되스라 제와이나 디바 샤바레 되이나다 디니 디바디마 다야게 갈라가 버려서 그러다 진짜 지동해봐 매시데 샤와 잠기 디바 답에 내가 요 말해서 디바 답발라 되네기 돕치시면도 내 디바 숙치에 다야다 되네 요모와 다야 되네 개발들이에서 다시 니어 되게 지바래 님보 군로 숙치마 간실에 준주 배주 숙자고 제조로 와다 네
So the Tibetan starts with a linking word, linking this final lengthy part to what came above, so something like moreover. And so this is showing that what Lama Tsongkhapa is writing here relates to what has just been presented above, which is that when one purifies by means of the four opponent powers, then the karmic imprint is likely to be reduced, but reduced in its capacity to either ripen or, should it ripen, in terms of the capacity of the potential result, that too can be reduced. But how much so? Well, as now it continues to explain, there is no categorical certainty. In other words, it is not certain that if one applies the four opponent powers, the ripening result will change from this to that. One cannot say that what the change will necessarily be, because it also depends on whether the power of the person during the purification is great or small. So this then particularly refers to the motivation of the person, because the power of the person, of course, doesn't refer to anything physical, but the power of the motivation. So if the motivation is one of, I do not want to suffer, and one is still very much, though, one's understanding of suffering is what one experiences in this life. The sufferings of this life are still what dominates one. Then the strength of the motivation is going to be comparatively limited. One still may be purifying or engaging in the four opponent powers of sincerity, but if one has a broader view, looking beyond this life to future lives, one is likely to have a more a powerful motivation, be of greater strength. And certainly, if one is relating to the non-virtue that one is wanting to purify now, through the lens of, this is impeding my liberation from cyclic existence or my attainment of Buddhahood, then the motivation is going to be much stronger. The practitioner will have greater mental power. And likewise, if the person is relating to their purification through the lens of these negative imprints on my continuum hinder my spiritual development and therefore hinder my capacity to be of meaningful benefit to others. This too, such a motivation then, is one that is, again, of far greater power. So therefore, when we see here, the power of the person during the purification is great or small depends on whether their motivation is lesser or greater. And this also relates to what we see a little further on, intense or not intense. If the way the motivation arises within one is heartfelt, it will be intense. And that will make a great difference in terms of how much purification is done. And in the sentence before, or the segment before, whether the 4 opponent powers are complete or incomplete, this too makes a great difference. If one only utilizes some of the opponent powers, the strength will be far less than if one utilizes all 4. And then the final point is the duration. So if one just purifies once, and maybe quite quickly, the effect is going to be quite less than if one does so with an intense and powerful motivation, with 4 opponent powers complete, over a more extensive period. And likewise, within all of this, we also can relate to something we looked at last night. If one is merely reciting words, going through a sadhana, for example, merely reciting words, then it's not likely that much purification will follow. So it really depends on many factors here, many interlinked factors, how much purification will come through one's effort.
Tenegi nimbo topshi nane da sunjimbi topchir chikyoba tim chi tenegi sharamya bache ananga zu dikwa shagin sipi da sosugun sunga saya da garachebine tichebane yan nimbo chik topchi sango marwa mazo bacha gurwa odusi dene denegi zoba ina da gari yonglasene shukta meja shayade nimbo sunjimbi topchilo gyoba di gyumzen samdan kazi shukchebe yoba ina andele dene nimbo di ya shukche yoda ndele dene mo ni tomsim di ya shukche yongu baza di shukta meja shayade denegi chi gyoba gye shukche shungo tone ane nimbo di ya shukche yongu re cheza dene ze diba talo shukche yongu re shayade diredwa.
Where we see here whether the 4 opponent powers are complete or incomplete, whilst this refers to whether all 4 are complete or not, in particular, whether one has generated sincere regret or not. Because as we saw last night, and was mentioned last week too, the opponent power of regret or remorse is of supreme importance to the extent that one sincerely regrets what one has said or done, with the resulting wish arising, I wish I had never done that. To the extent that that arises within oneself, one's regret is sincere. And if one's regret is sincere, then one's restraint, that the mind of ethics, the power of turning away from further faults, that will be sincere. So therefore, regret in particular, that opponent power, is of great importance. Regret too impacts on the quality with which one will apply the antidotes, with which one will go for refuge, generate bodhicitta, and so forth. So it is of particular importance. And moreover, when one generates regret, there are different ways of generating regret. One can merely recall something that you feel bad about, and regret will arise. But to make regret as powerful as is possible, one needs to utilize reasoning. And this is the same with every mind in the Lamrim. By utilizing reasoning, it will arise in a way that is far more transformative than if one merely recalls what one has, in this case, a negativity one has done. Because one will understand more clearly why it was harmful, what about it was so harmful, and then the various stream of events that led one to acting or speaking in a particular way. And this, based on reasoning, the suffering that comes to yourself, to others in this and future lives and so forth, will aid one's restraint. because of the quality of the mind of regret being greater. So therefore, in brief, regret is of primary importance amongst the opponent powers, and in particular, it should be generated based on reasoning.
Lena Gaba Yariani Chumisawa Sonore Ejere Lenam Gaba Yariani Chumisawas Jezada Le Dona Doda Duada Dodina La Carsone Le Divigi Andrike Takivile Nada Miguel Nada Kaleji Sasawa Chela and the Gaba Gersonaya caught and never check Mares, says a lady with Miyagi, level Nedigores, all those in Sonshas or do Sungoroda, Dene and Zada, Daddy laying Dene Son, that may be lady, that digi Jebudi, laying a lady Gaba Jayan, that drove in a Dagmare soon was, she said that Nimbotoshi when the jump and that was a Mares and became some Nora, Yungor, in it. Lenam Gaba Jarian Chumisa.
So now we come to a new part, subpart within the manner of purification, where we come to understand how purification works in relation to some of the statements presented before. So on page 121, it was presented how karma is certain. In the general presentation, karmic cause and effect, was presented that karma you have met will not dissipate. And then later on page 137, we looked at how karma is definite to ripen and karma that is not definite to ripen. So here, the Lama Tsongkhapa presents how purification relates to karma that is definite to ripen, and also in relation to the statement that if a cause is accumulated, the result will follow in the general presentation on karma. So reading from the text, the statement in the sutras and the Vinaya that actions will never be lost even in 100 eons. So here this is showing that karma that one has accumulated will be experienced. If the cause is accumulated, the result will follow. That karma is definite.
Lena Gaba Jayani Chumisa Sunduas, Kawa Jason by ne, Miki Vili, Nabi Lady, Kawa Jason by ne, Dagmar, Season called Injimij Mane, Jebud Yongu City Sunduas, Zada, Nimbotushu and Chamba, and Nabi Lady, Tibatige, and Tatu Mares, Sungorta. Takashi did on to Kashi get a Tatu Mares, Matibi Gimze Karesene, Dodeta Luna, Duana, and the Sunduas, and Odusin Kuntone.
So here we've been reminded of what we've looked at in this chapter, and it's being backed up by quotes from both Sutra and also the Vinaya, where it's stated that if causes are accumulated, the result will follow. And if the causes are fully accumulated, it is certain, it is definite that the result will follow. And this is something not just stated in this text, but it was stated by the Buddha as well. So surely, if in relation to this, there is a certain karmic imprints that cannot be reduced or eradicated through purification.
Di dodigi long digi donda jumden kar sungora sene mang nge bele digi nyembo topchu kone shabane dag mares ne sungo mares di donda karela na nyembo topchu kone ma shaba ina ane le digi le ge jebo digi nyembo topchu kone ma shaba ina dene gedi ne ane ko chola joyo mares or 그 제부 마음이 바꿔봐 결손바 이나야 레기 내신 팀 제부디 미야레스 지난 시에손바니 돕시 년보 공바 매발라 공기 근데 돕시 년비 셰바다르 장난이 용해자 다바르 계동 제발에 송소스 제사다 다디드 송아디 까바 자리야다 세기마레 송아디 년보 돕시고네 마사 마장바 있나 아니 레디기 용과에 다 제부디 용과에 까바 자르소나야 제부 용과에 내리기레스 털라 책마라 주사 책마레스 어제사디 년보 돕시 먹은 바 있네 되네레스 중국어마도 년보 돕시 공바 있나 아니 디니엘에 셰바나신 장바이나 용의길이야 다루고레스 다그레스 디 금쟁가서 양 다그레스야디 디야 안에 콩가리 열서네 계동비 저와 계동 자와스 디나를 송요레서 된 다그링이 시 년부터 쉬고네 장바이나 예벨레디야 다루고레스는 송요레스
Reading from the beginning of the paragraph. The statement in the sutras in the Vinaya that actions will never be lost even in 100 eons implies if the antidotes of the four powers are not cultivated. So what we saw earlier on page 121 is that if the causes are accumulated, they're not going to naturally weaken over time. And that is certainly the case. But if the four opponent powers are applied, then they will weaken, maybe even weaken so significantly they cannot ripen. So therefore, we have the meaning of implies if the antidotes to the four opponent powers are not cultivated. And then furthermore, also commentary on the perfection of wisdom in 8,000 lines says that if purified in accordance with the explanations, even karma certain to be experienced is purified through the antidote of the four opponent powers. So here is another sutra quotation which says that we have the presentation on page 137 of karma that is certain or not certain to be experienced. Even karma that is certain to be experienced can be purified by relying on the four opponent powers.
데더르 샤바다 담발라 소페스 네민진비 뉴바 냠바르 제바 남니 겐셴다 체야 네민진바 진바르 미교라 대신도 로다다 콘트 계자 준바라양 ndabar towe bawale sonsos.
A further quotation is provided from Blaze of Reasoning, which says that once you have thus, so further explanation from there, once you have thus weakened the potential to bring forth a fully ripened effect by means of confession and the resolve to exercise restraint, that's two of the opponent powers, and the like, reply meaning the others, the fully ripened effect will not come about even if other conditions are met. Conversely, wrong views and anger can similarly overpower the roots of virtue.
데들 샤바단 담발라서 더나디 소랑 저기 다 님부터 쉬고네 디바샤는데 데네기 난 디바샤한 님부 다 저게 군로다 데네기 아니 지 대시 또 충유거네 샤바서다 데네기 제라기 님부 충화로 데네기 님바샤하로 진다 아니 니기 레기 다 디베레데 다마토 바이나 가르치기레서 하송호래 제산 디 다마도바나 가르치 온 그랬으네 데더르 샤바다 담발라 소베스 네민진비 뉴바냠바르 제바 남네스 제산데 레드 마다바나에 다마도바이나야 디게 제부 네민기 제부 용하데 뉴바디 냠바르 제바레스 냠바레스 오래 제산 냠바레 제산 디네자 레디 콜 예데 바레디 나 다요마디나 네민기 제부게 뉴바디 냠바르 제바레스 가서 뉴바르 냠바르 제바레 디네자다 냠바르 제바자 아니 마오바네 겐샤나 체바이나야 네미 제부디 동아디 용어 말해서 그래. 제부 겐샤나 체야 네민 진바르 미규라스.
Looking at this statement in relation to the Blaze of Reasoning, once you have thus weakened the potential to bring forth a fully ripened effect. So this ties to what was presented in the paragraph above, that it's not certain that a non-virtuous karmic imprint will be completely eradicated, so as it does not exist on the continuum anymore. And why is that not certain? For the reasons mentioned, depends on the quality of the motivation of the person engaging in purification. It depends on the intensity of their purification, the duration of the purification, whether the opponent powers are complete, and so forth. So it's not certain that the karmic imprint will be completely eradicated. However, it can be weakened either slightly or a significant amount, again, depending on the quality of the motivation of the person engaging in purification. So this is the meaning of once you have thus weakened, because again, it may be weakened, how much is uncertain, but it is likely to be weakened through the application of all four opponent powers. The potential to bring forth a fully ripened effect by means of confession, and the resolve to exercise restraint and the like. So it's referring to all four opponent powers being utilized. The fully ripened effect will not come about even if the ripening conditions for it are met.
Chitanda 70 mewa mazina 70 pa medam la shaji ptösi megi shukin drögi shukin keje ko nubadi chik nyamso ina din 70 sawal tapshane 70 yordi ina ko nyuje gi nubadi nyamchare chesada dinige 70 sa ma tap delia ane chuda luda anji garchevene jebuke 돼요 말아 그래서 그 jebuke nuba nyambare chesa kin sada chuda luda 제 차상 창화래 돼 있네 jebuke 요 말아was on be dinashin Divas Sashi TB lady and Yampotoshi on the Dushin and Shaja Shabaina and Denigi Pet Koran Sav Dipping lady Meva Sumatuanea and it by Tibuchi again, nobody by Yam Shabaina, Yambaina, Yenshan Tabaina, or that Duanyaki would mean to my essay.
So if we utilized it as an illustration, that of as planting a seed in soil and whether it will sprout into a plant or not. It depends on whether the ripening conditions for that seed are fully accumulated or not. And if they are, it will ripen. However, if that seed had been removed, in other words, like a karmic imprint completely eradicated, there would be nothing that could ripen, even if all the conditions are there. But what's much more likely through purification is it can be likened to a seed that has been damaged or harmed. And depending on the quality of the purification will result in that seed being slightly harmed or damaged beyond use. So if it has been, the four opponent powers been well applied, that seed has been so damaged, then even if it meets all the ripening conditions, such as being planted in excellent soil, the warmth is just right, the moisture is just right, it will still be unable to sprout.
대신도 로다당 콘트에 계좌 준발라야 안잡을 도게 바와래 송소하시되 나데 데다 대신도 시대 한지데 계획이 미기획이 마소녀 동안 용거에 레디 코벳 코르메바 마쇠바네야 디 니버 좀 바이나 디 제보 안 동안 용어에 미에 민도하스 디나시 당한저 콘트로당 로다 계쟁아 저 계획도 저 계좌 준거레스 계좌 좀 바이나 제자디 계좌디게 제보 다 계좌딘 마 로다다 아니 지게 콘트로기 좀 바인자 디기 제보 아니 대화녀야디 괜찮다 채베나 용어 말해서 디나시 오두신 도에 바와나로 송요레스 거래 도에 바와나로 송요레스 디가와 송요레스 도에 바와나를 디네 송요레스 록도에게 로다당 콘트에 계서 좀 바이나 디니 계서 디기 제보 안 대화디 용어 말에 괜찮다 채베나 안 대화 제보디 용어 말 용민기 말해서
Blaise of reasoning also states, now the final line, conversely, wrong views and anger can similarly overpower the roots of virtue. So thus far, we have been focused on how to purify. Therefore, the focus has been on purifying non-virtuous imprints. However, virtuous karmic imprints can also be harmed by anger or wrong views. And just to say, as a translator, this word overpower, it's a good translation of the word. In other texts, you may come across as destroy. That's the word can be translated in that way, but in this context, overpower or harmed is a better translation.
Dine zadang juge that sanye gi lamde nga zulya dunga le kyoye ge tarpi ge lam tablam that given yamle che lamrim bam hoshite juge that dochine de tembading ju cherim chigi mang juja an dochine seshena ro chesa dine za do samdai de da sanye se di shen simjengi simjelle jewa chimbo yuban za da simji dunga se ya tablam yamle che ge an odoshine tarpa tamji kebe ko ba lam yamle rimbate dinegeda je yamle jebaine da ya jiga ne dinege ki ngamane sa shabe susu lam yamle rimba ma jibe kabla ngamane sa shibe dibada an da de jebaine ma ho bana ya ja sa ba ne gar jigere sebe dibaina dinege ne ngamane sa shibe dibadi ke chasa ya dia ne mya ba so ya tablam garse nyembo topshu ko ne ja ya do chen ja yore se jeza dunga se ye tablam dila 도시나 사이에 송바링은 독재의 침명원의 송 진행 되내기 이제름 지가 줄야 남름나라 도신 제시에 당한 주게 되내기 저지 람르 롭상 제어도 디네스디게 하고 안지 사이에 안제 동아시안 되어 주베게 탑라 냠레림 바템바 아니 그녀만에 아직 저기 아주 냠렌디디 마제니엘랑 아주 디바사샤바나 갑갑리에 디바사바 이나야 안데야 디바샤게 탑랑 유바 템바데 도시는 아주 하고 와디라 베 안절리아 상이다 디네게 라미게 제시나바디야 진체보 그린체보 디네게다 하고 와디 아주 베 가와상보다 휴식 지레르 와다 디네 하 먹고 와 있나 다른 거기 디네게 데 메바서야 탑람디 싱바르 바베네 도시네 디네 자데 디네 하고 베 아주 게지 that goes on that the Yaburwa.
I'll just say a little about the kind of mental attitude to have towards the process of purification. Because in the process of purification, it necessarily requires focusing on non-virtue, focusing on faults, focusing on things one has done wrong, generating regret for one's own way of thinking, acting, and speaking. So the way of thinking to have as a skillful practitioner is within maybe you could say within the warm embrace of refuge. One recognizes that the Buddha attained his complete enlightenment for the sake of ordinary suffering beings just like myself. Beings who yearn for happiness, but are so confused by their ignorance that they keep creating the causes for further suffering. Despite wanting happiness, we keep creating causes for suffering and destroying our causes for happiness. Yet, for people such as myself, the Buddha appeared in the world and taught the Dharma. And independent on those teachings, countless beings have become great beings themselves, such as Lama Tsongkhapa, who has presented these teachings in a way that's easily accessible, that are manageable in the sense that even very simple people like ourselves, ordinary people like ourselves, we can cultivate these qualities within. So therefore, we are actually incredibly fortunate. We are amongst, you could say, the handful of beings in this world who really have a fortunate life. In that, we, through this presentation, have come to understand what are the causes for happiness and the causes for suffering. And we've come to understand also the method to train in order to attain lasting happiness. And we've been taught this by someone who once was an ordinary being, but through cultivating these teachings within their own continuum, came to become enter the paths, become an Arya Bodhisattva, become a Buddha, and therefore perfectly understands where we are. We have an aspiration for happiness. Now we have developed an aspiration for Buddhahood, but we are still, as ordinary beings, will continue to create non-virtue. Therefore, our situation, looked at from a limited perspective, is really quite dire. Whilst we may have a desire to become bodhisattvas and Buddhas, we keep creating non-virtue. And we have this big store of non-virtue on our continuum already. But our situation, when looked at realistically, is not dire, because we've been taught a skillful method that we can easily employ to radically transform our situation. So the reality is, between now and the attainment of the Arya paths, we will continue to create non-virtue. But by applying the 4 opponent powers repeatedly and skillfully, we will be able to turn away from non-virtue, accruing ever less as we purify past non-virtue and change how we think, change who we really are, through changing our way of thinking. And in this way, our situation is not hopeless, because we have all the tools required. So therefore, when one engages in purification, it should be with a joyous mind. The mind of regret, this of course is not necessarily joyous, but the result of one's purification should be a strength of mind, a confidence, a joyful attitude of, fantastic, I have purified. So this is the skillful attitude by which one should engage in purification. And it's a skillful attitude because it comes about independence on a broad understanding of what one has been taught.
On those young denegi some damina, that's on you Jimlendi, Korongi, Yamlenji, Yamyong, Tony, Tangazoliba, Chike, Semjengi, Dungasia, and Digi Tubiage, Chedo, Songa, that's our champion Songa. And the Jawadat, and Jiki, Yagaraki, Komolula Sopa, and Keru Pandri, the Tikima, Aduchi Sanji Sung, Danger Combateva, Tiki, Pema Sevi, and Jane Chempada. And the Anachiki, so Lozawanam do Sine, Bedu, Beki, Gur, and the Anma, Jeremy Chronozic, Lobsang, that do Sin and Anzuki, Depsom, Son Shabadi, that do Sin some Navet Bear, Anzuli, Jin Chimboda, getting Chimboshu, and they saw Chasang Anzulia, Pembe Sim Konagi, that Pessim Jelia, Pembe some Lorangi, Son Shabakanya, do Sin, Chagurwa, and the Lozawati, Guriati. Sanji, Dembata, Shelley, Pembish, Song, Gua, Yan, some Gulonde, that the Nigim, Jeremy Chelasopa, the Negida, Sajakayu, Nima Risumachi, Kitchen, Dabanima, to Sonship, Chazada, Zulia, to Zeo on the Sonship, Yanya Chagor, the Nesam Damana, Bed Chazan, change about the getting Chimbori, and Began to do Chene, the Konozuki, and Nelia, Debagia, Chisuira Chedi, Letuyaki Ungorova, Chazan. That this would Jeremy Cheta, the new Konozuki, Depson, but this way, and Muraya, Depson, and the Toya Marua, and lots of what you do, but you the Pajilla Jets, Kahaska, you Marua, the nigger, and the Mara. The dancer in them, Deproach, so many depth depart, Chickasosuki, Gerachim, Depchon, Diva, depth depart, Chickazona, the Nigatone, and Sosuki, Benjor, Dutupcheda, Yungorwa. Denegate, Rimetia, Denegate, New York, Alaborwa, and the men big that Kava, Chikitinigi, Shigandia, Pazo, and the Chitobohalia, she Kava, the Kate, and Kishidu, Lajamongoja Orwa, Denegi Mato, Denemen, and that remit on the Shahan New York, USC by the Mato, Kalahaorwa, that is not any major mission of Bombulu, so Yagai Pandit dedicate somebody, then Denegi Kayamara, that shall have Pembes and Bashi Soma Yachadua, denies in that chair, Michel Sobat, Denegi, Akidun and Son Shapiki, then Chiga Dirwatch, Chesam, Shanlet Zewa, Shan Simjan, Pembe, some Hone Son Shapa Yachadua. The down to do it, yes, and Depia, what you get at him, Chas on the Ditsona Shagrimado, that Denike Kaleo Shagua, says that the some down a bear must say Sanjeta. The change you, Yagaju to Shin together, Mandata together, and the Lozawati, you Lozawa you can, and the Berge Lama, Yamne Nasia, Tangazulia, to see Lupson chair you again. Sayaka, you, Nima, you, Risumachi, Lama Konozu to see, bear getting Chimbori, stand on to the Lupson chair about you. Go bear or some time and you do stand that the nigga Lamanum get in Chisu, Sanyi, that get to Chisu, Sanyi Chisu Temba, Church Chisu Temba, Sachago, Jirenshina, Sanyi Chisu Temba, Church Chisu Temba, Sanyi, Church, Jinchimo in Matea, Lama Sanyi, the Jinchimo, Sanyi Chisu Temba, Church Chisu Temba, said Udushin Chagor, Dines that I want to do some dana, and get about me Basaya Chagor.
And a further skillful way to think, and I encourage you to think in this way regularly so that it becomes something that naturally arises in one's mind, is to recognize our great good fortune as well as the tremendous kindness of so many others. So Buddha Shakyamuni, we can have confidence in his teachings because what he taught came about independent on his own experience. It wasn't that he came across a set of teachings that made some sense to him and therefore he read them out for others to hear, but he taught what had worked for him over countless lifetimes, how he had radically transformed his mind. That method, those techniques, he taught. So we know from his experience it worked. And we know from the intervening millennia, countless great practitioners, first in ancient India, they took those teachings and cultivated them within their own mind. So the great masters from Nalanda monastery, such as Nagarjuna and so forth, incredible beings who, in dependence on the Buddhist teachings and the lineage of teachers who kept them alive and vibrant by developing them within, taught them on. And then the great translators from Tibet, who at great hardship and personal cost traveled through the Himalayas from the land of snows to the land of great heat. And they took the Dharma, translated it into a new form of language that they had devised so that it could be brought to Tibet. And through their endeavors, as well as those who encouraged and helped support them to do so, the presentation of the Dharma by means of the Nalanda tradition was kept alive for a further millennia and a half in Tibet. It was not lost. And it was kept alive there through the lineage from the Buddha, through the great masters in India, the translators bring it across to Tibet, and then centuries of incredible teachers from the various traditions, initially the old school, that of the Nyingma, and the various newer translation schools of the Sakya and the Kagyu and the Gelug. And so all these great masters who made effort to learn the words of the Buddha and cultivate them within their own mind have kept the teachings alive and vibrant within Old Tibet, and thereby, now through exile, has been made readily available throughout the world. So recognizing where we are in terms of a recipient of the kindness of so many, of this entire lineage from the Buddha and his a great effort over countless lifetimes, and the great effort of innumerable practitioners from the time of the Buddha to the present day. Being aware of that kindness, we can recognize that we are actually supported. Our process of mental transformation, which you may often find frustrating or difficult, we are actually supported. We are supported by this broad community with this deep lineage that is supporting us now. So that's one benefit of recalling the kindness of others in this context, that we know we're not alone, we are supported by others. A second benefit is we recognize that we actually have a responsibility to repay this kindness. We have the same responsibility that every practitioner throughout 2.5 millennia have fulfilled. They have received the teachings, recognized their great fortune, recognized the kindness of others who have kept these teachings alive and vibrant, and they have repaid that kindness in the most meaningful of ways. Through developing their teachings within their own continuum and helping others to do so as well. And this is something we all in our own way do so here for each other. In that, the very fact that we come together, this dependence arising, is dependent on everyone in this room individually, as well as many not in this room over the preceding decades. And when we think of, in particular, at the times of great uncertainty in the Dharma, for example, when it was transmitted from one culture to the next, or moving into exile, then it was kept alive because of people clearly understanding its value. It wasn't at all, especially in those times, something that was kept alive because people wanted to be famous or they wanted a financial reward. They had a genuine motivation through recognizing its great value and potential to be of incredible benefit. And throughout this time of the Dharma being kept alive and shared, the dominant motivation was not of reputation and prestige and being well thought of and being liked, or financial comfort, financial reward, but it was to be of benefit, to transform one's own mind so that one can be of ever more benefit. And we find today that the Dharma in our modern world is, in some instances, such as these teachings here, it's freely offered. And there's very little in our world that is freely offered. What is seen of value, seen to have benefit, is commoditized, is sold. A profit is made from that. And sometimes some income is required because there are expenses. And what we find in our Dharma world in general is that things are either freely offered or offered for a small amount just to cover expenses, and that is required. But in our world, this is a very uncommon attitude. And this attitude comes about independent on recognizing the great value of the Dharma. The great value in terms of what it can bring to each individual, but also to others. So therefore, I encourage you to recall the incomparable kindness of our founder teacher of the Buddha, to recall the incredible benefit that comes from his teachings, and recall the great kindness of the entire lineage of practitioners from the Buddha. In fact, one can even go back before the Buddha to those interacting with the being who would go on to be the Buddha, right up to our present day. And here include our community and those who indirectly support us here and directly support us here. It's independence on everyone's endeavors that we have this incredible opportunity here. And through this opportunity, we can accumulate great merit and radically transform our minds. And by thinking this way, by thinking in the way here, recalling the kindness of others, you yourself will accumulate great merit. But not only that, the motivation to contribute, to repay the kindness will grow. And that will push you forward to let go of everything that currently dominates one's mind, that has no real importance, and to embrace that which does have meaning, that which has real value.
Denegi Chuyamri Rimbadi Gachimbo Chai de Kalahaba Chadore, Carsone Garum Jipemena, the Lama Gishitike Payo Mare, Jana Ligo Martini, Chushik and New Charugua, the Garum Jipeto at Bay, Masi getting Chimakarum Chiku Tuja, getting Latine, and the Zubber Michel Osopada, Lama Michel Osoba Dusine, and the Yamen Lobsang Dorje, Denishin and Chesol to dance Australia to Dushin, Yav Kazagal Pechin to Chesol Zuje. And they are to church and Yamlin go up there. Just do some diet or the Nigi, several Micheda, to get the Nigi that do in the source, and the church or Chudere, and the Nigi, Jikbe, Yahuchadi, several Miche getting it, several getting the answer to getting it. Then the several Miche and the Garden as the Lama Shell, Lama Shell getting, Lama Shell, several Miche getting. Thing on to get in Chimbore. There and the hot was ne, Yarum shall to you, just a Yarum chicketty, Yarum jedini pemena, Lamash Supermiche to the Negichi Halcheso to share the Kalahaba Chadur, just a Yarum chicken to jail at the Yomare. Or do sin that do share, that Yarum chicken there sometime in a Yarum Junior Burlia, and the Yarum chicken, Koronte Lama Jerem Shala Sobat Lama Command Getenity. That big Lama the Lobzo Yabonyam Jewtier, Katabana, and then Jinganzuki Yagar Kepi Pandutiki Raligora. Yagar Keru Pandutiki Sonadia, Diana, Jumden, San Jumden, somebody. Jenata do Susanto, Chick Danger said, giving Yamnaja, the Chick Chill and answering Yamnaja, giving Yamnaja, Chusha Jang to Quavasa, Lama Super Michela, and the Jinganzuki, Lama Shelia, Danger. Dia and the Yajarum Shelia, Danger. Yarum China and Gomanam Kiki, Bergi Kava Lamanam Latindeba. And Bergi Kava Lama de Gena, and the Yahar and the Pandita Tesolia. How to say Tendeba. Yah Pandup de Gichinium de Sonadia, Zawa, San Jim de Tendeba, San Jim de Chesumena, Yah Pandup de Kitini, Martishi, Yadiga Marva. Says I do in some died. That do say Tende Chichilitin, some died, Tende that Chigu, Jungung, Manjangan, Nangbi Chigu, Jungu, Tartu Zawa, that number San Jim de says Zawa, San Yel 2 or said Denis some Dana show. Denis some Davena, Nanganzu getting Chisu Jang, and the Lama getting Chisu, the Lama, Lamation, and Severum getting Chisu to bear, Jingan getting Chimbu, getting Jam. They getting Giant, and there's Jawam Shell getting back, getting Zachim, getting Chimburidos. The next some night, Nelama command them Jeda, Dushin and Jeremiah Sobanas, Gilupazivana, Dusha Lama command and getting there. And this you could pass some time, Anti Tender some time, Jesu young and Yahapan Pandita. That the Bandit Jutin La Soba Desole, Shungle, the end of Lobsang Dorje, Bandit Jutin, but getting Chimbores. That Bandit Jutin, the chose the Ningan to the Pandoja was on a radius or two was that's San Jim Dendes. Just that San Jim Dendes, then beginning Anzulia, the usual Dunga say, get Zawa Zawa Tatu, the Dumba San Jim Dendes. So the Dushin do some Tavena, the Lamada. Gibe Lamada, Zawa Sanyeta, just Dusha getting Jesu Jamba Shayan, then Desolia, getting Chimbo Jambana, they are put a simping at the Devaki Gorova, Devakena, Gushep de Gorova, Jezana Devakea, Gushep Gea, Desi Lamanam getting Jaya, Jeza Lamada, Tinigi, Dushin Jedu, the Lama Jesu Jamba, and then getting Jesu Jamba. And then Sanye Jesu Jamba, Churches Jamba, said to get Jetantiki Ligore, just like the nation of Dushin sometime. And give about Megasa Yungorwa.
And to talk about this in the same context, the situation of Tibetan Buddhism specifically, because that's a form of Buddhism that I'm most familiar with. So here we can recall just how incredibly fortunate we are that His Holiness was in the position he was in Tibet when the communist Chinese took over the country, because he had the quality of being, therefore had the foresight to know when to flee to India. And we sitting here receive so much benefit from that decision. Because His Holiness fled to India, he was immediately accompanied and certainly followed immediately by a great number of lamas and geshes who otherwise would not have left Tibet. They would not have left His Holiness. So his decision ensured that despite the hardships of re-establishing the Dharma in exile, it could be re-established, and through his efforts, it was re-established. So by that decision and his resulting endeavors to encourage and guide others, the Dharma was re-established in exile, and great beings were able to spread around our world, bringing the Dharma to others who in this life would otherwise have had no access to it. So here, again, looking through the lens of our own experience, and if you have experience more broadly, you can recall them. But we think particularly of students of His Holiness, such as Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche, how through their incredible qualities and the expression of those incredible qualities, the Dharma has been established in many places, including here in the bush in regional Victoria, where we come to directly receive benefits. And this reflection can be done by people in their Dharma centers throughout our world, both within the FPMT and the other various Dharma traditions. And here we can recognize the incredible role that His Holiness played in our life, directly in our life. And here, when we think of this lineage, so it spoke about His Holiness and his endeavors, bringing forth to benefit in this life. His Holiness became the being he is, independent on an incredible line of teachers before him. So he had the teachers that he had in this particular life, as well as the line of teachers he would have encountered in previous rebirths, going back to Lama Tsongkhapa and going back to the Pandits in India, who all either directly or indirectly have helped create the environment that great beings will be reborn in. And here, so we can look at our present situation. We can go back through our own teachers, to His Holiness, back throughout the great masters of ancient, of the Old Tibet, and to the great masters then in Nalanda, and going back to the Buddha himself. So we can recognize how interdependent we are, how our current position, our current incredibly fortunate position, is dependent on so many. So I encourage you to think in this way. And this is a worthwhile way to think. You don't need to be sitting quietly in your room. You can think about this while you're going about one's various tasks in the day. It's a worthwhile way to think rather than on the various comings and goings in the world. Because by thinking in this way, one comes to appreciate and value the situation that we have. We don't take it for granted. We don't see it as ordinary. And we hopefully challenge this presumption of, oh, hopefully next life I will do better. We need to do the best we can right now, in this very life. Moreover, by thinking like this, through recognizing the great kindness of others and how we benefit, we also recognize our own individual responsibility. Because whilst we are, in English you'd say, cogs in the wheel, we are very small cogs in this overall wheel of the various bodhisattvas and the enlightened activities. We are all a part in this interdependence, that through our own endeavors, we enable others to be able to experience these teachings. So we recognize that this is the way we get to repay the kindness of our teachers, and we get to value and appreciate our fellow practitioners evermore, recognizing that in dependence on their mere presence, I also get to come here. So I encourage you to think like this often. Recall the kindness of the Buddha, the great benefit of the teachings, the great kindness of the lineage of both the masters that have kept the teachings alive and vibrant, as well as all the other ordinary practitioners and people around them who helped support them in their spiritual development, right up to our current situation today and those around us here. You can do this reflection starting with the Buddha moving forward, starting with our current teachers moving back, and in this way, one can really appreciate what we have, and it helps to ensure that we utilize what remains of this life well.
다도 신고를 당한테 예비게 예바 다바세 딜레 디바 다바세 딜랑데 니용고래 전당번에 근데 디바 마제바 있는 가서 셈디 디바 다바로와 다바세 등 장마로 차고를 장마서 고로와 그래서 당번에 디바 마제바나 디바 디베 다바샤고래 아직 디바 제바 있나야 님부터 주고네 디바 샤바이나 메바셔바이나 난 디바 다바세로 디바 다바세 다 다바세 니용고로와다.
Purification. Now returning to purification, this is done in two directions. One, in relation to karmic imprints already abiding on our continuum, so the non-virtues performed early in this life and lives previous to this, as well as to the non-virtues that we recall accumulating perhaps like today and yesterday, the more recent ones. So that the purification is directed both to what one has done in the past as well as to what's more recent. And it's both, what's been directed is both a purification and a determination to change the future trajectory.
That debate about Penang Julia, the Missubigi, Mimasuba in that Missubigi Dipa Sayo Marava, says that Anazul that the Missubigi Dipa Dava chat, that Yomare, Kosayo Mara, says that 거 라신게 담번에 띵아주 미스비 디바 마다바 다바 차대로와 저 디바 거고요 말와.
So we probably sitting here in a position, hopefully, where we have not killed a fellow human being. So this is probably not something that we have to purify.
아주 디바 담번에 아주 디바 라신 맞게바 다디바 망부요래. 베네가 저기 다좀바 쇠바다 최딘 시바 공부 돌아라서 바다 데네기 제요 말와 맞게바데 디수 아니 데네기 디바 디기 중요 말와 제가 디바 고 담번에 마중바 다바 자들와.
So we could say there's probably quite a number of very bad non-virtues that we haven't engaged in. So we hear about those of I think they're called of immediate retribution. So like killing one's parents, killing an arat, and killing bodhisattvas. So these kinds of grave non-virtues, we almost certainly do not have on our continuum, and therefore we do not have to purify.
There's corners hela so bana there's and chakwa so bada the zun shela so bada digi done diba mangbura sik yedro wadanza.
What's most likely to be dominant, the imprints most likely to be prevalent on one's continuum, are those that have been created through anger, through attachments, through lying and deceiving others. These we probably have many of.
Dine zada dusungore, chida shakdamgi lama maluba dado chukyang sede, da dambo ne nyebe magoba dabase. Chida da nganzu diba sayo bay ne, nyembo dojo kune sha je, chinchin na zao gine chigime ese dam shakdam je yondu, diba nga saba je ma chasang daba je yungure es, dado chukya, daba, dado yungure es, daba de yungure es ore.
Returning to the text, so at the very bottom of page 147, although through confession and the resolve to exercise restraint, you may be able to purify karma so that none at all remains. And the text continues, there is still a big difference. There's still a big difference between the purity of not being tainted by faults from the beginning. So it's a little difficult because the structure of the English sentence in the Tibetan doesn't match so well. When the translation is correct, it's just the word order. So the Tibetan is literally first having, through faults, not tainted one's continuum. So that's the first part. First through faults, not having tainted one's continuum. Meba digba meba de la ni yungures tambo dibo yoba je nimbo tojo kone sha sane meba cha diba meba sa chi yungures tambo ni diba masa ba je ane nyebe ma ho ba je diba meba sa je o ni yungures da di yungures ni di che da di ni di khabar gar yosne sha ne daba ni khabar che des di ni di khabar gar yosne khabar chimbu yore la re 제가 디바 매바 찍바래 돼 그렇게 해 버려 요러시네 당보인데 디바 먹어 봐디 야가래서 당보인데 네바 마집이 마제제 디바 먹어 봐디 다 봐디 약쇼래서 제가디 니 대야 당보 디바제 님보 dob죠 거네 샤네 디바 다 봐대 당보인데 네바 먹어 봐 디바 다 봐인데 그렇게 해 버려 요러시네 대 캐버 침보요래서 디 캐버 침보디 제가 네바 당보인데 네바 마제 봐제 디바 다 봐디 약쇼래서 그러다 디니 샤나 So what's been said thus far is that whilst the non-virtue one has done can be purified, and it goes on here, there is a great difference between the purity of not being tainted by faults from the beginning and the purity after confession. So in other words, As I mentioned, there are a number of non-virtues probably none of us have done, and not in this life, nor have on our continuum. The killing of our parents, the killing of an arat, maybe even killing a human being. So these may not be abiding on our continuum at all. But there are other negativities, such as from anger and attachment and so forth, that we certainly have done and do need to be purified. So there's a great difference between having purified a misdeed and never having done that misdeed in the first place. So here the difference is vast. So even if one can purify something, if one had never done it in the first place, there is a vast difference.
장사리 자동 중화라 장섬유 돈바 랑비 치르뉴강 치르취뉴강 체데라 ane 체데라서 사당보 톱 미시베 송바당스.
This vast difference is then explained through an illustration. For example, Bodhisattva level says that if a root downfall has occurred, it can be restored by taking the Bodhisattva vow again, but it will be impossible to reach the first ground in this life.
네, 장주신비게 냠len 지겐디게 다 장주신비 돈바 렌제 자동 윤의 마중화제 냠len 지간 대당 장주신비게 돈바 송제 다 장주신비게 자동 중 다전 중제 아니야 자동 중제 대내야지 어다 샤도 장주신비 야제 돈바 쉬제 바 자동 바 치주여 바네 치주여 자동이 디바 다바의 용거래서 제가 용어에 되니게 정신선비게 자동 중차네 양자 정신선비 돈바슈 되니 자동 주 디바드 바 치슈 제제 안 다바 이나야 안디기 체델이야 사당부기 톱투고 말해서 체델라 사당부기 정신선비 통람 고마 톱투고 말해 체델라 그래서네 고 자동 중시 디바 다바래다 토야리야 톱투고리 베스네 이나 톱투고 말해서
So the Bodhisattva level is presenting that a Bodhisattva, there's a vast difference between a Bodhisattva who has taken the vows of the Bodhisattva and is guarding them in an excellent manner, living in accordance with them and not therefore transgressing them, and a Bodhisattva who has committed a rude downfall. Whilst a Bodhisattva who's committed this downfall can purify their downfall by receiving the vows again, they are greatly spiritually impeded. They will not, in that life, come to realize emptiness directly. They will not come to attain the Bodhisattva path of seeing, or the first ground in this life.
되네 정신선비 돈바라 자동 마중 녀바 당보는 마고바 있나 아니 세델이야 통나토바 용그레스 아니 되네게 자동 주제 녀바 중제 녀바데 치주제 다바 있나야 녀바 다바레데 있나 세델이야 안 정신선비 사당보 고마 토토와디 용마레스 대 장산나라도 송바레스.
So the example then is that two bodhisattvas, two ordinary bodhisattvas, if one lives within the restraints, the ethical restraints of the bodhisattva, and thereby does not commit a rude downfall, they can come to attain the bodhisattva path of seeing in this very life. But another bodhisattva, perhaps at a similar stage or development, should they infract their rude downfalls, their vows, infract their vows, and commit a rude downfall, whilst they can purify that by receiving the vows again, their spiritual development will be impeded, and they will not be able to realize emptiness directly in this life. They will not attain the bodhisattva path of seeing, or the first bodhisattva ground in this life.
Benedict nido chegor dang zo din ma modern nyamdo ma melon ma droache koso ba chik de ma droya koso chi drobaina da ro du ane chik di bani lamga di wa 남비 덴마르도 주진일 따라 저거로만에 주진일 저거로도 뒤ser 마선 되네 자당 지디 다 모델면이 지그 콜로도 와라 소바다지 지견이라 쉬어셔 견쉬어셔 다 지디 견 마셔져 코도 줘셔 되고 미 주진이 따다 마저 그러봐 다 지디 견쉬어자 다 직견쇼네 다 견쇼도 소교 당제 견매바 쇠사로다 쇠사는마 당조베네 주진이 나로 걸레 투야 메르와다 간실레 주지 주지 체하야네 제레티그레 안에 주지 직제레데 고메니 쇠레 균링을 고고로와 지산 균가제 링하고 베네고 제레티야레 마고 고고로와 지사데 주지 직고에네 아니 그 말이야도 주지 숨스고 고르마도 주진이 나로 레투야 메레 주지 체가 고베네 그 주지 체가 봐 그 제레 태바레 주니 나로 레토에 메르와 제산 견마 견쇼바네 견쇼는 소교 당지 견매 쇠바레 견매 차바레데 이나 베니디스 따따레 레토야 주니 나로라 레토에 메바레고 메 딘마르 디르와 베디나제 차기도 와다.
This can be likened if traveling to Melbourne. We know from here it would probably take a couple of hours and one will arrive in Melbourne. But should one have a puncture on the way, well, a puncture we know we can repair. We got hopefully a spare with air in it, and we can repair our puncture. But it will take time, and afterwards one will need to drive more slowly. One will still arrive at Melbourne, but one will arrive much later than if one had not had a puncture. So it's very clear. At the outset of one's journey, one does one's best to ensure that one is prepared, so that one doesn't have any obstacles like having a puncture. It would mean the journey goes more easily and much more quickly.
언더나 데니기 디바 샤바데 디바 다고 오레데 디바 다바레데 이네 또보 양 또보 뭐 공부데 깨발라 아니 균링하고 그래서다.
So therefore, in a similar manner, whilst non-virtues can be purified, they do delay one's spiritual development. Therefore, they are best averted.
어느 도시는 장사를 송바레스 안디나지야 넘버 타바 디베 놀레 장 되데네 시비 최봉의 디버 중화 시기 르든이 바도 니레신 뒤숨도 샤나 디바 다장 지더 뉴양 쇠바 토바라 까와 주거 벌송소스.
Further illustration is given, a further example. Also, the Gathering of the Thread Sutra says that once the bad action of abandoning the Dharma, which is explained in that sutra, has occurred, if one confesses it 3 times every day for 7 years, the bad action will be purified. But still, it will take 10 eons, even at the quickest, to attain the level of forbearance on the path of preparation.
number tabi dibe donala dodine songbe chebongge dipase da dinale an dinishin chebongge dinishin chebongge le sagrese din chebongge le sadam bu songyore jeza dina chebongge le sabi diba chebongge le jungje denige chebongge le dipa dibige pa jungshin denige ane nireshin denige chebongge le di ane nimereshin do chine shaje le dungi bado nireshin do 두숨의 샤나서 다 로든이 바 샤야의 두수의 로든이시 대야 샤야기 림바데 니메레레리아 살숨숨숨숨 두시네 샤바이나 나두시네 샤바나 디바데 다루오레사지 대야 샤야기 로든이르는 샤 대샤다데레 니메레리아 살숨숨숨숨 샤 두시네 샤바네 디바 다그레스 단 데네게 디바 다그레데 이네하다 다디 전주sem바 초람바로 샤고르 초람바로 샤기도와 데니기 전주sem바 초람바디기 데니기 최봉을 해서 바지고 니메리리라 살숨숨숨지 르든이 바도 디바 샤바네 디바 다루 그래서 이내야다 지더는 유량사 다데니 초람바디야 똑바 톱제 전숨 줄라 그 쇠바 전주sem바 줄람 쇠바세디 디고바 토야라 로가제 고르스네 가제 교가 톱나 지더는 유량 토발로 로주고 그래서 지단 가제 교고 토반에 로주 나르마 토토 말에 로주 고그레스 다데레 데스마도 로주 중이 정아 데네 나서 과용을 가제 뉴바이나야 교가 데네 디바 샤제 가제 교가 토바이네 로주 고그레스지 손도와 지단 뉴야 쇠바 토발라 까와주 아니 까와지 로주나 까와주 고그레스 까와주 고버 손소스.
So this illustration would refer to a bodhisattva on the path of accumulation. If they commit the misdeed or the non-virtue of abandoning the Dharma, having come to recognize that, to generate a sincere and profound regret, they will engage in extensive purification. And we see this being explained in terms of the extensive purification 3 times in the daytime, 3 times, 3 times every day for 7 years. So doing purification practice, it's dedicated to this one downfall 3 times every day for 7 years. They can purify that downfall. So it has been purified. But their spiritual development is greatly delayed. They will remain on the path of accumulation for an extensive period, and before they eventually achieve the path of preparation. And even when they achieve the second of the 5 paths, the path of preparation, to progress through its 4 stages will be greatly delayed. And as it says here, before them to reach the 3rd of the 4 stages on the path of preparation, the level of forbearance or patience, this will take at quickest 10 eons. So thereby we see that because of this downfall, their spiritual development is greatly delayed. And this follows them engaging in successful purification practice.
Dene za da nangbo yin di ba de ma go ba de ge che re so da ngo du shen de dene za ji za da nga ju ge a da ga ya ma di ba sha chu re sha da tu re sen be ge dene sam da be ne di go ma re dene za da nga ju ge chi sho de nangbo ne di ba ma go ye che de ge chi sho re es da de di ba go ba ne de sha ma sha ne da ya re da shi re ine da di tu ge che de nga ju ga nangbo ne ma go ba che de ge chi mo re es dene ge 당보는 마고바 제 계침보래 당보는 그에제 되는 샤바에네 아주 또고 고방 토발로 균두고 고구도 와서 제가 당보는 마고바에네 또고 토발이야 교화로 또 레투고로 와서 그래.
The meaning of what we're seeing here is that non-virtue accumulated or vows that can be broken, these can be purified through their appropriate means of purification, and therefore the suffering result will not have to be experienced. However, there is a residual negative impact that hinders one's spiritual development. Therefore, it is imperative that one rather avoids incurring any non-virtue and does not be deceived by the attitude of, it doesn't matter, I can purify later. This attitude is deeply mistaken. Our spiritual development will be greatly impeded. Therefore, our ability to be of benefit to others will be greatly impeded.
제부 이도 묘와 침바 말류바 다바 인기서 제자다 말다 말류바 다바세 님보 도슈군에 샤바네 디바디 말류바 다바레스네 디 다베게 되나 카레스네 디바 디기 제부 이도 묘와디 귀네 요에 메바 쇠샤바레스오라 데이제 델야 아니 님보 도슈군에 다바세 디스오레스오 다바 말류바 다바 차산 다바레스도 다 님보 도슈군에 샤제 님마 디바 디바 동아 빠도면 봐 용거에게 규사 사바이네야 데니기 뭐 도슈고네 샤용도 아니 디기 마음반에 제보디 동아도 용 먹어야 쇠샤바라 뒤에 싸우기는 용 먹어 봐 데니게 쇠바들라다 말루바 다발하게 해서 말루바 다베드네 제보 이도 명와 진바 말루바 다바 인지스.
The text continues, therefore purification without remainder means that the production of unpleasant effects is purified without remainder. So again, one can purify broken vows, one can purify non-virtue, but in particular if one does so through the 4 opponent powers as explained. But what one is purifying is the ripening effect. As we saw in the previous page, the strength or the way the ripening effect ripens can be greatly transformed, or it can be weakened to the extent that just nothing, there is no negative impact and no suffering impact that is experienced. So this can be done by purifying in the way guided. However, there remains a residual impact that hinders one's spiritual development. Therefore, it's important to ensure that it does not engage in non-virtue from the outset.
dine inge mato lam yu toba jewa so ne che ring du zhuwa inbes jisa di ina dikwa daba malu ba dunga nyoma ba zao yin nyoma ba sui ba re de ina lam yu toba jewa le ta gyuning bu cha ba res che ring du zhuwa inbes dine inza gyuning a zhuwa re dine inza dangbo ina ma gui ba le pe par cha wos dangbo ina ma gui ba le pe su chi ma che wo res.
So therefore we are being urged here to, from the outset, to refrain from non-virtue, to have our mind free of such imprints, and not to think, it doesn't matter, I can purify later.
And
this is very clear because through the illustration that I gave earlier about it's better to drive and not get a puncture. Because if one, let's say, drives with the attitude of, I can drive carelessly, or I use my phone while I'm driving. If I have an accident, it's not the end of the world. I can heal. I can take time off work. I can lie in hospital. I will heal. Not a big deal. And the car, it's insured. I can replace it. That kind of attitude is hardly praiseworthy. One would not want to be a passenger in such a car.
Oh, yeah. Dine inza dei chiris. Dine gyumtsen dine inza ansiwar. Chizan gyumtsen dine inza papa nam soge chiyang dikdung chamo la yang shishun do michuba songde. Chizan papa gansa dike diba chungchung chigli pe chig yune denegi diba magoya ya duchin nangore ese shishin do michuba songde.
So look in the text, however, since the rising of realization to the path and so forth will be much delayed, you should try not to be tainted from the beginning. So that's been covered. Also, for that reason, it says that Arya beings do not deliberately engage even in subtle non-virtue or infractions, even for the sake of their lives.
Dine xiaobe daba dan dangbo nine majungwa nile kero me na so da diba xiaobe daba dan dangbo nine diba majungwa nile kero me ba ine dine ane ya topo gongbo de zhoba le kero me ba ine ane dedar xia gobe dedar xia migu be chiro se de dedar xia migu ba suya se de papa nam ji so ge chiyan dibi chamo to le mi ji ba sung go ba di gyumzen ga re se ne Tokaya 공부도 좋아해야 아니 바도 균을 고한사 안디 지고로 와 제가 되니게 샤는 다 받으라 되니 캐버면은 되니 당보 있는 되니 제고야 가민도 와서 그래. 자 미국에 치료스. 샤바에 다바당 당보 있는 마중에 캐버면은 니 캐면은 대달자 미국에 치료스.
Therefore, we see that for a committed practitioner will have renounced the concerns of this life. Only spiritual development matters to them. So they will not engage in negativity for the sake of some temporary pleasure or to overcome some insignificant problem. They will ensure that they live within the restraints of what is ethical. So this is then the meaning of avoid non-virtual infractions even for the sake of their lives. And furthermore, if there were no difference between purifying them through confession and their not arising from the beginning, there would be no need to act like this. So this then is the logical conclusion of what has been presented above and the explanation given. And finally, in the mundane world too, if a wounded arm, leg, and so forth heals again, still it will not be the same as if it had never been wounded to begin with.
당부 차체 안에 소교 나제 규명을 차디베네 야 디와레가 슈심보다 베제 슈심보다 왜네 안균 니균 차에게 내가 여러분다 이만 마차바 나신지 용고 말아 제가 되게 개발도 와서 제가 되네자 당보니네 많이 받아 미도와시는 거니 개발 신보도 와 빼디나시리에서다.
This is a good example because you possibly know from your own lived experience what you've observed that whilst many injuries, for example, can be treated well through various medical techniques or even surgery, and one can heal from not just injuries but also from illnesses, one doesn't always return to as new. There's a lost period of time with great effort and energy required to go through various treatments and eventually heal, but one does not necessarily return to the form or the state one was in prior to the injury or illness.
Yeah. 나디바도 가르도라스는 아주 기부 충분히 남이림바 시행하되 안에 기부 충분히 남이림바 삼바장와 오해서야다 안에 오해서야디 사지마서 숨여라 삼바장와 오해다 삼바디 기비체 안데라 로도 세수세 삼바 이내당 대 기부 충분히 남이림바 삼바장와 오해서는 냠는 가르가르 지역으로서 제다디 오해네디 두세디 마시 사와래 근데 삼바장 삼바 기비 체세와 되는 데래 로도 가베 수스 로도.
So this coming up to this point now, we've looked at over a number of chapters the various trainings that are shared with the practitioner of initial capacity. Now we come to the measure of that attitude having risen. So how one actually recognizes whether one has fully accomplished these trainings which are shared with a practitioner of initial capacity and has such a continuum. And then that will be followed by clearing up misconceptions about that.
당어도 기부충에 남지 림바 냠는도서 제고래서 마 냠는 지다 림바도 마시에살에 다들 기부충에 가서 지와메다 받다 단주유 리테 삼다야 지와메다 봐 삼다야 안디네 어다 데디기 아니 가소리 레균제 삼다야 데네기 아니 냠보 냠로지야 데네 냠보 돕슈코네 디바샤야 어두신 차상 마 슈사르와다 슈사르 기부충에 삼로 냐람 냠네 림바 제사디 냠는 제사디 마 슈사와레 기부충오다 투모에 남지 림바 냠네 제사디 마 슈사와르와다.
So therefore now we've concluded the presentation on the training shared with the practitioner of initial capacity, where one starts by reflecting on this incredible opportunity that comes with this rebirth and builds on that then by recognizing, but it is impermanent. It will come to an end, and it's not only that it will end, but it could happen at any time. And when it comes to an end, all that will matter is my karmic imprints I've accumulated in this life. And where I will go to afterwards is either to fall into the lower realms, and we look then at the suffering of the lower realms, or in the high realms. And then this is used as the motivation to go for sincere refuge, and we looked at the mind of refuge in the three jewels. And then, having got to that point, one then turns to, so what is it that I need to do to ensure I don't fall in the lower realms but attain excellent rebirths? What are the karmic, non-virtuous karmic causes to avoid, and how to do so? What are the virtuous karmic causes to cultivate? And we've looked at that, the presentation of cause and effect now, in some detail. So these are the various trainings that are shared with the practitioner of initial capacity. They're not separate individual ones, but one builds on the other. And by training in all of these together, one is training in these practices that are shared with the practitioner of initial capacity.
나도 전에다 냠는 제제 다네 당어도 기부충에 남이린 바로 장 냠는 제도 다 기부충에 삼바 개와디 기비기 체가를 했다. 다 되는 지나가 어디 두스네가 기부 충에 남이린 삼바도 수기에 살게 나리 똑바 계속 계마서서 기비 체대가 해서 다마 체대 주고를 기비 체대가 해서 간에시 삼로 간에시 개와이나 다 기부충에 남이린 바 냠는 지네 삼바도 개와를 해서 간에시 되는 게면나 되는 게토요 말해서지.
knowing those trainings, having embarked in them, then we come to look at whether one has crossed over the boundary of whether one is a person with deep interest in the Dharma, but whose mind is still predominated by ordinary mundane affairs, or whether from the perspective of the Dharma, one has become a practitioner of initial capacity. So there is a boundary that one crosses over to become a practitioner of initial capacity. So here we look at what that boundary is.
Samba Keware, Titaniki Mena, Kibo Chung Sang, Lamirim Tumo Lamirim Ki to your mother says. Tako on the Kutil Masona, Kutita, Drumderuji, Gaja Denis Rana, the Drumje Temple, the Madena, Toya Mother said, Diru Chagor.
So this is the point where each of us, we mark our own homework from this past couple of years to see whether we've passed the exam or not. Or let's rather, as a translator, let me rephrase that. So just like in everyday life or one's education, there's an exam where one is graded on how well one has come to learn the material, how well one has integrated the material. This is what one does here in terms of one's spiritual development, to come to recognize how well one has integrated the material or not, whether one passes the exam or not.
Jidin chimi dunyer gi sik je jangbe go zamdu gyuwa de gosa pwe de chimi dunyer zo songxin jidin de sharjung zamdu songna geba yin la wangyan tenpar che gui be de jungne yang be de jangwar chawos.
So reading from the text, the measure of that attitude having arisen. Previously, you had an uncontrived interest in this life only, and your interest in future lives was just a vague understanding elicited by the words of others. Once their ranking has been switched so that future lives have become the main interest and this life nothing but a byproduct, the attitude of persons of initial capacity has developed. As this, nevertheless, needs to be stabilized, you should strive to train in it even after it has arisen.
Then ngar jidin dis dunye chuma mai ba yelas sidang hanzo denige chue nyamlen maji nyele nganzo nala samla karyorasne da jidin di chedigi dunye chedigi dang hanzo ge longje da ane ji degi chedi zamyi degi da longje da de ane dunye damnyan la soba dunye chuma mai ba ta dira gu de je gu de sembege da hanzo samla na denige yores da jesa da chedi zamye digi dunga seya digi juya ane so ge 안지기 benjuruya di don da lega janya jigoro da nga samno na le de ki shukshen bu yores de zoro da ane yores jidin chima dönyer gi sik jeso 장wa 장유 go zamdo gyures jidan gewa chima 가시에는 jidin chima se de samno khoron 고고 마 삼 khoron dango marwa da 가시에는 jidin chima da gewa chima 세드 개와 치마 디기 고래 제 개와 치마 동아 연구를 선배기다 개와 치마 세드 삼로 쉬어베나 되니기 시기 지수 좀 왔zam다 먼저 칸에 셰바 zam도 심 딩기딩 어절레데 연구 말해서 시기 지수 장유 고와 zam도 규리에스 아니 어절라 다 아주 최 많이 냠는 마지베니라 먼저 삼로 되는 시어레서 어절이야.
Previously, you had an uncontrived interest in this life. So this refers to a mind that is dominated by the concerns of this life, a mind that is primarily concerned with what others think about us, whether we have financial security or our financial situation, and our various enjoyment of comforts and pleasures and so forth. In other words, where what dominates our thoughts, and therefore what we speak about, what we engage in, is this life's the enjoyment of this life's pleasures and attainment of this life's pleasures, and conversation and thoughts about this life's problems and how to overcome them and having experienced them and so forth. This is what dominates us. So previously you had an uncontrived interest in this life only. And then it continues, and your interest in future lives was just a vague understanding. And then our concern for future lives, this is something that just does not come about in that unless there is specific cause that pushes us to think about it. Because this then is the mark of still being an ordinary person.
That is that do some literature. That you get you to call a share and do and then Tetelia and Jinga Tenjulism, which is Tachimboria, and the day and the Jibari, Midabari, Namching Eve, and she do it. Just as she Kabla, Manzu Lonja Karina, Kedra Mare, Pandohayo Mares, and the decade the Kawa, the Tibakar Saba, and the decade of said, the nigger some Lobsang Dorje. Then said did I give a chimani got the chairs and give a chiman bed, Uniwood said that Tonton Tonton. Then as she named Yamamoto was I gave a chiman my key to Gure, give a chimajena and a career and a Kesa de Yawa that you know, I saw that didn't need it. Chesanga Yawanga son of Dendron Dungal Casangandri given Dunga Poto Meba Yungo in the URS at the name Bashi. And these one my young carson. Gedi one Yungore, Chesada, Lake Dinner Yungure, Chesan Le Dibasana, Dunga in Yungure, and the Kawasaba in the Dendro Kigre, Chesada Dungatis Yungu, Mares, Chesada Dibonkiru chair, and Diba, the Nigi Kawa to Kawa to Bores, and then they do not say, you by the Sula kept no conscious of yours, Camro chair Wores, and the Nigi Divade, and the Diba to shake your Markewa to Bores, Lunga is near to the Mutsurim Song to Kawa to Bores at those shares, some Dini to Guachang. Dene Jane, Dene on the Diba, the near Pont Shubanaji, that Diba Yamashaba, the Sayan Diba, the Shoutum Chevores. All those general songs, Dening on to Deneg of those and Lojan Chene, Jeza Dene Zada, that said Dida, Chimani said that Chima de Geshe or Edwas and because some Hakoche, Dene that you were Chimal Yadana, in Nason Megawa, Wondokoma Togus and Big Denegi, some Naji, Dangan to get Jando, Jando do, Jan. That didn't some died didn't until Karaki is in a Chimi doing your zoo song, Stangan some Nalia, Kiwachimagi Dondalia, Chick Nansol Media that did when you go on Toyaki Donal. That's somebody, Takiwachimadi getting a Kiwachimadi, somebody Geshe sometime. Di Yoyagi Dondalia, and the Geshe Toyadi, so at Yamachi, didn't say Digi that Jidin di Xiaoxiong the song. Said this said that Digi that so Jixam Jig some big that Xiaoxiong some so on the Legajed, gave a chimney Dondalia, and Dushine, a Kawatuk to some Tavaina. The nigger some not gave in, and it give a chungi Lamirimba, some not the answer to Kiava, as you were. Then they gave a chimney Donda or some Dashi and Legaje, Gava together, this some diet. Said this some get Xiaoxiong some that Dushine. Xiaoxiong some dash ever done. The nigger some of the court away, the next some of the Gigu Banada, the Kibu Chunga Lamirim by Yamlin Jebege, Kibu Chunga, Lam said you must really give what is order. On the Giva in last, Dibado. One just said she. Giva in last. There's a Session142 doesn't give a in last.
So that then is an explanation of what would be considered someone who's not yet, from the perspective of the Dharma, a practitioner of the Dharma. But by engaging in the reflections that have been presented thus far, reflecting first on this precious human rebirth, recognizing its great potential, And then adding to that the reflections on impermanence, whereby one comes to recognize it is going to end, and that is certain, and it could happen at any time through any number of manners, any manner of means. And when it ends, all the resources that I've striven to acquire throughout my life, all the pleasurable experiences I've had, the valuable friendships and relationships I have, all of this will be left behind. And therefore, all my energy that I put into them comes to nothing. All that it will take with me are my karmic imprints. And where am I going to take them? Well, I'm either going to go into the lower realms, or I'm going to remain in the higher realms. There are only those two directions. And what determines those directions are not the possessions I've acquired, the relationships I've developed, the physical state of my body, none of that. It's the karmic imprints I've accumulated in this life, that and that alone. Therefore, I need to engage in the accumulation of virtue. This is what matters. And together with this, I need to refrain from accumulating any further non-virtue and purify what has been accumulated. So in this way, through going through these meditations, one building on the other, one comes to recognize that our future lives are far more important than this brief life. And this then arises within oneself, not independent on hearing an inspiring teaching or reading an inspiring book, but independent on one's own reflections and arrives spontaneously within oneself. One doesn't need to sit down and do some meditation. This is how one thinks. Whilst one may well enjoy the pleasures of this life, the attainment of them is not seen as particularly important. Whilst one may try to avoid the problems of this life, the avoidance of them is not seen as overly important. This then is the measure of a being of initial capacity. And the text here says, once their ranking has been switched so that future lives have become the main interest, and this life nothing but a byproduct, the attitude of persons of initial capacity has developed.
ane bede changwar chawo se dinige samno jeba ina dadi ade keso sande ni sha ba ne yane yano sam yaje ma cha ba ina ko ma ya nyam do nyanga yoro inzada ko tembu juma ma imba jiu ji syo ge ko ko je tembu chaya ge da la temba ji ko res 제자 dini inza yane yando do shine kom ko sam tam ko res.
The final sentence, as this nevertheless needs to be stabilized, you should strive to train in it even after it has arisen. So through the efforts that one has made, one should not think that is sufficient. This needs to be at the point that it's spontaneous, ever present within oneself, so uncontrived. In this way, we can guard against it declining, against its motivation declining.
원료 고방도 땡델이야 아니지 람 지기 달바다 탐지 캠비 고방 차상 냠는 제 투에게 땡개발전 당 원료 고방도 마토나 탑미 디 토버 지기 세베게 디 삼로딩 어저기다 게디나 디스콜 고고래 제자디 디 돈달라 안다 개와도 레가도 땡데게 삼로데 게디네 아저기 개와 침미 땡 원료 고방 땡델이야 달바다 탐지 캠비 고방 람 용수소바 냠는 제투에 땡개발전데 개와 침마 되는지 마토나 탑미디 디 토버 지기 세베게 디 삼로디다 디소로 디기고래 디삼로디 다 디삼로디 슈첨보 코야데 이나 아니 디기 돈달라 토비 돈달라 당 저기 계획자와 강토도 주야 디용고로 봐 지사디 디네 삼당이도 인계비게 세디점에 자와디 파 바지 샤숑삼도 수아디 디용고래 지사 돈다 인보디르다 저기 치미된 조르 송신 세디 다 조르 송세디 개와 치미기 당 완성을 타르지 원료 고방 토고도 지자 된 개발지 원료 고방 된del이야 타바 탐지 김고 고방 람님네 차산 제투에게 원료 고방 마토네 탑민도 디토벌 지기 선배이다 디삼로디다 안줄이야 다디 양 고고래 조디기 고고래서 다 지자 기부 중국이 투모와 람미리 바기 강을야 로브자제 냠는 제기 다 냠는 제기 제부 좀 될 마서나 제부디 디 용고 그래서 디기 오고 그래서
the meaning of this measure is that one's interest in future lives is what motivates what we do. It is not that one abandons going to work or that various things that we do and interactions with others. One doesn't necessarily abandon that, but rather what motivates our various activities, such as going to work and many other things we do, as well as what motivates our interactions with others, is the thought of how this is impacting our future lives. What are the karmic imprints being accumulated? This is what dominates us. This is what guides us. So therefore, what really comes to matter to one is the causes one is accumulating in relation to our future lives. And this then influences how we experience this life, how we experience this life's pleasures, how we experience this life's problems. So this here, the middle sentence, once the ranking has been switched so that future lives have become the main interest, and this life nothing but a byproduct. So this life's pleasures are enjoyed, but they are seen in their actual light, in their truer light. Likewise, this life's problems one tries to avoid, but they do not dominate one. What dominates one is the accumulation of causes that will lead to excellent rebirths and our ongoing spiritual development.
Denige samlo kieshine, denige samlo chuma mayimba nganzu gyula kie. Di kunwa denige samlo tone nganzu jimbe nyamlenjea, tsurum nyamlenjea, sebe nyamlenjea, zunru nyamlenjea badi chasan di kewa di chasan kibu chungo da tumo lam yirimba sayadi chagor. Chisan denige nyamlenjea chadi kibu chungo da tumo lam sayadi chagor. Denige kieshe nyamlenjea wana denige jimba da tsurum seba, zunru nyamlenjea 기부 총도 투모람 이름 봐서도 차고래. 제자들이 해자다 아주게 디 람림 다디 깨어도다 마한선 마서나 단야 강말 줘야마도 오마 대선직 마서나 직 육처바로 차고로 와.
Well, the trainings that we presented thus far, these are the trainings to develop a motivation that is common or shared with a practitioner of initial capacity. With such a motivation then, being primarily focused on future lives, not being overly concerned about this life, one then engages in the other actual practices of the Dharma. So again, these preceding chapters were about developing the motivation, and then with this motivation, one engages in acts of generosity, ethics, patience, and joyous perseverance. Then these two become trainings that are shared with the practitioner of initial capacity, because one has this motivation which is common to or shared with a practitioner of initial capacity, whilst engaging in generosity, ethics, patience, and joyous perseverance.
Gyawachima ondio ngasola tarachi ondio koma ten kyabachen dal deshi shubana je tarba tamjeki ba lamyon so nyamde jetu gen ten kyabachen matum tabminde de togudu sanbegeda di samlke de nganzu de di samlke be chese de be geshe de gechimbo direda da deshi gangla sheba de chasan lobjong jebege tamala samle di ge wore de ge gogore da di ge chawe jele 니께나 디군의 랑제당 저 개와 카르투베네 차산다 개와치모 원dio 고바 개우 투모람 이르마 개와치모 원dio 고바도 규샤로 원dio 고바 때려야 디규투비하게 니 규샤로 그래.
So it really marks out this practitioner of initial capacity is this dominant focus on what is being done now in relation, or what is being experienced now, in relation to their future lives. They are not so concerned about this life's pleasures and problems. They are much more focused on what I'm doing now and the impact it will have in lives to come. Particularly, that it will lead me to gain a further excellent rebirth so that I can continue my process of spiritual development. This is their focus. And these various trainings practices prior to this, are about cultivating, how to cultivate this spontaneous focus, this uncontrived focus within oneself. And thereafter, all the other virtuous activities one does will lead to the accumulation of causes that will bring about such a result.
직계와 두개 가리나 돼 내가 좀 뭐지 무슨 제보나 신차되래 제산의 뭐라 가와 줘다 말해서 제보들을 하려고 나신다고 삼노디 차되래.
So the illustration of often used is that a car on its own goes nowhere. It requires the driver, and the driver determines whether one will go to this place or that place. So similarly, when one has developed this motivation that is shared with practitioners of initial capacity, all one's virtuous endeavors will lead to the attainment of that result. So this afternoon we'll conclude the chapter by looking at clearing any misconceptions that arise about that. And if there are questions, then please feel free to ask. Others, we can conclude there for this morning. Then thank you very much.